People said the war veteran was paranoid. They said it quietly at first, the way people do when they don't want to sound cruel, but also don't want to be corrected. He lived alone, far from town, on a stretch of land most people avoided. Too open, too exposed, too quiet. They told themselves that no one chose a place like that unless they were running from something. What they didn't understand was that silence wasn't what he feared. Noise was. For most of his life, he had lived inside systems that never truly slept. Engines humming, radios crackling, routines repeating until you stopped questioning them. When he finally left that life behind, he didn't want distraction. He wanted clarity. And clarity, he had learned, only appeared when nothing interrupted it. The land gave him that. The property sat in a wide valley where the wind traveled freely, unbroken by trees or hills. Snow behaved differently there. It didn't fall gently and settle. It moved. It scraped across the ground. It piled where pressure forced it and vanished where it wasn't allowed to stay. Most people looked at the valley and saw emptiness. He saw patterns. He noticed how grass leaned even in summer, always in the same direction. How meltwater carved shallow lines in the soil each spring, never quite in the places you'd expect. How old snow marks, faint discolorations in the ground, reappeared year after year in identical shapes. Small things, quiet things, the kind of details no one notices when they live among people. When the neighbors first saw him working outside the cabin again, they assumed he was fixing something, reinforcing the roof maybe, adding storage, normal preparations for winter. But that wasn't what he was doing. He was placing posts, driving them deep into frozen ground at odd angles, stretching panels where they didn't seem necessary, leaving gaps that looked like mistakes. From the road, it made no sense. The structure didn't form a clean wall. It didn't enclose the cabin tightly. It looked unfinished. That was when the comments started. They said he was overthinking things, that winters came and went, that storms didn't need complicated solutions. One man laughed and asked what he was afraid of. The veteran didn't answer. He never did when the question itself was wrong. He wasn't afraid of winter. He wasn't afraid of storms. And he certainly wasn't afraid of being alone. What concerned him was how people mistook stillness for safety. By the time the sky began to change, when clouds stopped drifting and started stacking, when the wind arrived with intention instead of randomness, the valley had already made its decision. The neighbors didn't see it. They prepared the way they always had. And they laughed one last time when they passed the cabin and saw that strange second fence standing in the open. They thought it was paranoia. They didn't yet understand that the land had been speaking for years, and he had been listening. Living alone changes the way time behaves. For most people, days are divided by noise, conversations, engines, footsteps, routines that announce themselves whether you want them to or not. Alone, time stretches. It stops performing. It simply exists. And in that space, patterns become visible. The war veteran noticed this almost immediately after moving into the cabin. At first, it was the wind. Not the sound of it, but the way it returned. Always from the same direction. Always with the same persistence. Even on calm days, there was a faint pressure in the air, a sense that movement never fully stopped in the valley. He began walking the land every morning. Not long walks, slow ones. He followed the same paths repeatedly, not because they were efficient, but because repetition revealed change. He watched how frost formed unevenly on the ground, how some patches of soil hardened while others stayed soft longer than they should have, how grass bent and never quite straightened again. These weren't signs of danger. They were signs of consistency. The neighbors didn't walk their land like that. They lived beside it, on it, but never with it. Their houses faced the road. Their attention stayed close to walls and windows. Weather was something that arrived from outside, not something already present beneath their feet. The veteran saw it differently. He had spent years learning how systems behaved under pressure. Not dramatic pressure, slow, sustained force, the kind that didn't announce itself until something failed. The valley, he realized, worked the same way. By early autumn, he began testing small changes. He placed a temporary panel near the cabin, angled slightly against the wind. After the first snowfall, he noted how snow gathered behind it, thinning near the foundation. He removed the panel and watched the snow return to its old pattern. He repeated this with stakes, with boards, with gaps left intentionally open. Each time, the land responded predictably. That was when he committed to the second fence. Not a wall, not a barrier, a guide. He positioned the posts carefully, following lines only he seemed to notice. He left space where others would have closed it, reinforced sections that looked unnecessary, and ignored areas that seemed obvious. From the road, it looked wrong. A neighbor stopped one afternoon and asked what he was building. "A fence?" the veteran replied. The man laughed. "For what? There's nothing out here." The veteran nodded. "That's what most people think." Word traveled faster than snow. Soon people were slowing their trucks, watching him work, offering advice he didn't ask for. Some suggested stronger materials. Others joked that he was preparing for something that hadn't happened in decades. They weren't unkind. They were certain. Certainty, the veteran knew, was the most dangerous thing people carried into winter. He never corrected them. He never explained the angles, the spacing, the gaps. Explanation would have turned observation into argument, and argument into noise. Noise destroyed clarity. As temperatures dropped, the valley began showing subtle signs of change. Snow arrived earlier than usual, not heavier, but more persistent. Instead of melting between storms, it stayed. Wind pressed it into long, shallow ridges that followed the same invisible paths again and again. The neighbors noticed the cold. They noticed their driveways icing over faster, their windows frosting unevenly. They adjusted thermostats and stacked more firewood. They did not notice the ground. The veteran did. He saw how the soil beneath the snow hardened in some places and softened in others, how water had nowhere to drain once the freeze set in, how pressure built slowly, invisibly, beneath structures never designed for it. The second fence took shape as winter approached. It didn't enclose the cabin tightly. It didn't block the view. It stood far enough out to look unnecessary, close enough to seem intrusive. People called it excessive, paranoid.
One evening, as the sun dropped early behind the clouds, a neighbor shouted across the valley, asking if he was expecting something terrible. The veteran paused his work and looked up. "No," he said calmly. "What then?" He considered the question before answering. "I'm expecting something ordinary," he said, "under the wrong conditions." That answer unsettled them more than any warning would have. By late November, the sky changed its behavior.
Clouds stopped moving independently and began stacking in layers, compressing the horizon. The wind no longer wandered. It arrived with purpose, pressing snow sideways instead of letting it fall. The neighbors prepared the way they always had. The veteran stopped building, not because the work was unfinished, but because it was done. He spent the final days before winter settled in, sitting inside the cabin, watching how the land responded to the smallest changes in weather. Snow moved exactly where he expected it to. Wind lost force where it was meant to. The ground near the cabin stayed balanced. Outside, the valley looked calm. Too calm. The neighbors mistook that calm for safety. They laughed one last time when they passed the cabin and saw the strange fence standing alone in the open. They didn't understand that paranoia looks exactly like preparation when you're early, and like wisdom when you're not. The first real cold snap arrived on a morning that looked ordinary. The sky was open, pale blue, the kind of sky that made people careless. There were no thick clouds, no dramatic warnings, no sense of danger. The air was sharp, but still. In town, the radio called it seasonal. On the road, a few neighbors drove with windows cracked, talking about how mild the early winter felt. That was exactly why the comments returned. "Still building that thing?" One man shouted from his truck as he passed the cabin. Another slowed down, leaned out, and laughed. "What are you expecting, Ethan? The end of the world?" Ethan Cole didn't look up right away. He tightened a bolt along the fence line, checked the angle of a support beam, and only then turned his head. The men were already smiling, confident in their own joke. "I'm expecting the land to do what it always does," he said. They exchanged glances, amused. "Land doesn't do anything," one of them called back. "It just sits there." Ethan's expression didn't change. He watched their truck disappear down the road, its tires cutting through thin snow that barely deserved the name. Then he returned to his work, calm as if the conversation had never happened. That was how he stayed sane, because if he tried to explain, he'd have to translate something most people refused to believe: that ordinary conditions could become lethal when they repeated long enough, and that the most dangerous forces in nature rarely arrived with drama. They arrived with consistency. By the end of that week, the valley had the kind of surface that fooled people: white and clean, like a fresh sheet pulled tight. Light snow covered the ground, and the open sky made everything look peaceful. If you didn't live out there, you could stand on the road and think, this is nothing. But Ethan saw the small movements. Snow along the eastern edge of the valley drifted a little higher each day. Not much, just a few inches at first, then a little more. The wind wasn't strong enough to scare anyone, yet it came from the same direction again and again. Snow didn't fall and settle. It slid. It stacked. It behaved like something being guided. The neighbors didn't notice because they didn't have to. Their lives were filled with noise: kids, jobs, errands, talk. When you lived inside a crowd, you saw weather as an event, not a pattern. You looked for big signals: a dark sky, a warning, a storm severe enough to become a story. Ethan had learned in a different world. In that world, the most dangerous things were the ones people ignored because they looked small at first. So he watched the valley the way he watched a perimeter. Every morning he walked the same route. He stopped in the same places. He studied the same lines. And what he saw confirmed what he already felt. The ground beneath the snow was changing. Not dramatically, not visibly, but enough. In certain areas, the snow crust formed faster and held harder like a lid. In others, it stayed loose and granular. Meltwater from the afternoon sun refroze at night and created thin sheets beneath the surface. Slick, hidden layers that allowed new snow to slide in long, quiet shifts. To most people, snow was snow. To Ethan, it was movement. He returned to the second fence and made a final adjustment. One panel angled slightly more toward the prevailing wind. Two small gaps widened by a few inches. If someone had watched him closely, they would have assumed he was being obsessive. Paranoid. That word followed him now, floating through the valley the way smoke follows a draft. People began to treat the fence like a joke they all shared. Some drove out just to look at it, shaking their heads, offering opinions without being asked. Ethan kept his responses short. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. The truth was, he didn't mind being misunderstood. He minded being interrupted. Because the more people talked, the harder it became to hear what mattered. Then on a calm afternoon, the first small failure happened, quiet enough that no one treated it as a warning. A neighbor's shed door warped and wouldn't close properly. Another man's generator sputtered once and died, then restarted like nothing happened. Someone complained that their back porch felt uneven, as if the ground had shifted. Most shrugged it off. Old house, old boards, cold weather, normal. But Ethan didn't shrug. He drove slowly along the road that cut through the valley and noticed something the others hadn't connected. The small failures weren't random. They clustered along a subtle line, an invisible path that followed the valley's natural shape. That line matched the one he had seen in spring runoff. It matched the faint discolorations in the soil. It matched the way grass leaned even in July. The land had a preferred direction. It always had. Winter didn't create that direction. Winter simply made it unavoidable. That night, the neighbors gathered at one house for coffee and conversation, complaining about the cold in the easy way people did when they believed the cold was just an inconvenience. Someone mentioned Ethan again, how he'd gone off the deep end, building that ridiculous second fence. They laughed. But one of them, the quietest man in the group, asked a question no one answered. If he's paranoid, he said, why does he look so calm? The room fell silent for a moment, then the laughter returned. People talked over the question until it disappeared, and the next morning, the valley looked even more ordinary. The open sky held steady. The air was still. The world seemed harmless. Yet the snow along the fence line had changed shape overnight. The drifts beyond it were deeper, thicker, tighter. Inside the fence's influence, the ground remained strangely controlled, less drifted, less loaded, less pressured. Ethan stood outside his cabin, hands in his jacket pockets, looking over the land the way other people looked over a calm lake before a storm. He wasn't watching the sky. He was watching the ground. In the distance, the neighbors' houses sat exposed, their roofs collecting snow unevenly, their driveways beginning to take on the familiar stubborn ridges. They would shovel and shovel, believing effort could beat physics. Ethan didn't feel superior. He felt uneasy, because when the land begins to show its decision, there is no argument that can change it. There is no explanation that can stop it. There is only alignment or resistance, and resistance in the valley always lost. Later that afternoon, the neighbors drove past again. They stopped this time, stepping out near the road, staring at the second fence. One of them pointed at a section where Ethan had left a visible gap. "See?" he said. "It's not even finished." Another laughed. "He built all that, and he still left holes." Ethan didn't correct them, because the holes were not mistakes. They were where pressure would escape. He glanced up at the open sky, then back down at the ground. The sky was calm enough to fool anyone, but the land was already speaking louder, and soon, whether the neighbors believed it or not, they would have to listen too. The change didn't arrive with sound. That was what unsettled people later, when they tried to explain how everything had gone wrong so quietly. There was no cracking thunder, no howling wind announcing itself, no dramatic moment where someone could say, "That's when it started." Instead, the valley did what it always did. It continued. Snow kept coming, not heavily, not violently, but steadily, day after day. The sky remained open more often than not, pale and indifferent, offering no obvious warning. The wind never screamed. It pressed. It returned. It followed the same invisible corridors again and again, and the ground, patiently, began to respond. Ethan Cole noticed it on the third morning after the cold snap settled in. The snow near his cabin had shifted overnight, not deeper, but denser. Beyond the fence, drifts had grown taller and tighter, compressed by repeated pressure. Inside the fence's influence, the surface remained uneven but lighter, as if the land had been allowed to breathe. He knelt and brushed away a thin layer of snow near one of the posts. Beneath it, the crust had formed exactly where he expected, hard enough to hold weight, but not so rigid that it trapped what lay beneath. Balanced. That was the word people rarely used because balance didn't feel dramatic. It didn't make good stories. It didn't give you something to point at. But imbalance did. Down the road, the first real problem announced itself in the form of a phone call. A neighbor's voice came through tight and uncertain. One corner of his house no longer lined up the way it should. The door scraped when it opened. The frame looked twisted, just slightly. "Probably just the cold," he said, trying to convince himself more than Ethan. Ethan asked a simple question. "Which side?" There was a pause. "The north side," the man replied. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. That line again. By midweek, more calls followed. A shed door frozen shut from pressure, not ice. A porch post leaning at an angle it hadn't leaned at before. A roofline sagging unevenly under weight that should have distributed itself but didn't. People started talking less about the weather and more about bad luck, bad ground, old construction. Anything but pattern. Ethan drove slowly through the valley, not to help, at least not yet, but to confirm what he already knew. The snow told the story clearly now. Drifts had formed in long, continuous bands that cut across properties without regard for ownership. Where the ground dipped ever so slightly, pressure accumulated. Where meltwater had nowhere to escape before freezing, the soil beneath stiffened and shifted. Foundations didn't fail all at once. They surrendered in increments. The neighbors reacted the way people always did when systems began to fail quietly. They tried to correct symptoms. They shoveled more. They reinforced doors. They adjusted heaters and blamed drafts. One man spent an entire afternoon hacking away at ice near his porch, convinced he could free the structure if he just worked hard enough. Effort felt productive. Understanding took time. Ethan returned to his cabin before dusk and stood beside the fence, watching how the wind slid along the angled supports and spilled away from the foundation. Snow accumulated where it was meant to. Beyond the fence, out of reach, redistributed harmlessly across open ground. He didn't feel relief. He felt confirmation. That night, the temperature dropped again, not sharply, but decisively. The kind of cold that didn't break things outright but locked them into place. When water froze now, it didn't expand gently. It held. When the ground contracted, it didn't settle back evenly. The valley was committing to its shape. By morning, the first structure partially failed. A carport roof collapsed under uneven load, folding inward without warning. No one was hurt, but the sound traveled farther than expected, echoing across the open land. People stepped outside, squinting at the calm sky, confused by how something like that could happen on such a quiet day. That was when they stopped laughing. Ethan watched from his porch as trucks moved slowly along the road, neighbors checking on one another, voices low now. The fence cast long shadows across the snow, marking the ground with lines that mirrored the valley's natural flow. Someone stood near the road and stared at it for a long time. Later that afternoon, two of the neighbors walked up to the edge of Ethan's property. They didn't cross the fence, they didn't call out right away. They simply stood there, hands in their pockets, looking at the ground on both sides. The difference was no longer subtle. Beyond the fence, snow was piled thick and tight, pressing hard against the soil. Inside, the surface remained uneven but lighter, less burdened, as if pressure had been guided elsewhere. One of the men cleared his throat. "You knew," he said. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He knelt again, brushed away snow, and pressed his palm flat against the ground. It was cold, firm, but stable. "I listened," he replied. They exchanged glances, unsure how to respond to that. The man who had laughed the loudest earlier in the week spoke next. "We thought you were preparing for a storm." Ethan stood and looked across the valley, where rooftops now bore uneven scars of snow and stress. "I wasn't," he said. "Then what were you preparing for?" Ethan gestured with his chin, not toward the sky but toward the land itself, toward the subtle slope running through the valley like a memory. "For this," he said quietly, "for what happens when pressure keeps choosing the same place." They didn't argue. They didn't need convincing anymore. That evening, as the sun dropped and long shadows stretched across the snow, the valley looked different. Not damaged beyond repair, but altered. Some houses leaned just enough to demand attention come spring. Some foundations had shifted just enough to make every door feel wrong. Ethan's cabin stood unchanged. The fence, partially buried now, looked less strange than it had before. The land itself had begun to explain it. People would later say the winter was harsh. Ethan knew better. The winter had been ordinary. It was the land that had finally been allowed to finish a sentence it had been repeating for decades. And once spoken clearly, it couldn't be unheard. By the time the neighbors returned to their homes that night, they walked more carefully, watching where snow had settled and where it hadn't, noticing lines they had never noticed before. They had stopped asking why Ethan lived alone. They were beginning to understand that solitude hadn't made him paranoid. It had made him attentive. And in the valley, attention was the only thing that ever made a difference. The valley didn't look dramatic once it was over. That was the detail people struggled with most when they tried to describe what had happened. They wanted a moment, a clear ending, a sharp line between before and after. But the land didn't offer that. It rarely did. Instead, winter loosened its hold slowly. Snow stopped arriving with purpose and began to fall straight down again. The open sky returned more often, pale and indifferent, as if nothing of consequence had ever taken place. From a distance, the valley looked much the same as it always had. Up close, the differences were unmistakable. When people finally began moving freely between properties again, they noticed how many small things no longer fit the way they used to. Doors that needed to be lifted to close, steps that leaned just enough to feel wrong underfoot, fence posts that had shifted out of alignment without breaking. Nothing catastrophic, everything permanent. Conversations changed. No one spoke about storms anymore, they spoke about ground. About how snow seemed to favor certain places. About how water moved before it froze. About how some houses felt settled while others never quite did. They spoke, quietly, about Ethan. No one used the word paranoid now. They walked past the second fence more slowly, stopping to study it, tracing its angles with their eyes. What once looked excessive now looked intentional. The gaps made sense. The odd placement felt deliberate. The fence hadn't blocked anything. It had allowed something to pass. Ethan didn't change his routine. He didn't offer explanations unless asked, and even then he kept them brief. He didn't point out which decisions the neighbors should have made differently. He didn't need to. The land had done that for him. When spring came, it came unevenly. Snow melted in patches, not all at once. Where pressure had been allowed to build, the thaw exposed subtle damage. Cracks that ran along foundations, soil that slumped where it had lost structure, boards that no longer met cleanly. On Ethan's property, meltwater followed clean paths. The ground released what it held without collapsing. The fence line guided runoff the same way it had guided snow, keeping pressure away from the cabin's foundation. Neighbors began making small changes, not dramatic ones. They adjusted drainage, repositioned vents, reinforced areas they had never considered vulnerable before. Some built modest barriers, not walls, not copies of Ethan's fence, but quiet acknowledgments that the land, not habit, decided what lasted. Ethan watched without comment. He spent his days the way he always had, walking the valley in the morning, stopping in the same places, listening to what the ground said when the rest of the world was quiet. Sometimes a neighbor joined him, not to ask for advice outright, but to walk, to look, to notice. Those walks rarely involved much talking. They didn't need to. The valley had become a teacher. By the time summer arrived, the story had settled into something simpler than people expected. It wasn't a tale of survival or heroism. No one had been saved at the last moment. No disaster had arrived to prove anyone wrong in a single dramatic stroke. What had happened was quieter. A man had listened when others didn't. He had acted when there was still time. And when the land had finally finished moving, it left behind a clear record of who had aligned with it and who had resisted it out of habit. One afternoon, as Ethan stood beside the fence, a neighbor approached and stopped a few steps away. "You were right," the man said. Ethan shook his head gently. "The land was." The neighbor nodded, looking out across the valley. "We just didn't know how to hear it." Ethan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The fence cast long shadows across the ground, lines that now felt natural, almost inevitable. What once looked like paranoia had settled into something else entirely. Experience given room to work. As the sun dipped and the valley quieted again, Ethan returned to his cabin and closed the door behind him. The silence inside wasn't empty. It was clear. Outside, the land rested in the shape it had chosen, no longer fighting pressure, no longer waiting to be understood. And for the first time in a long while, the valley felt balanced. Not because winter had passed, but because someone had finally listened before it arrived.